Hello, welcome to the Gio and Joey Show. It's been a while since we've talked, brother. How you doing? Let the people know what has happened in your scholastic career here in the last couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah, I finished up my last year in Seventh-day Adventist education ever. Well, unless God has some other twist and turn somewhere, but seeing as there's no Adventist law school, I'm pretty sure that my Adventist educational career is over. But yeah, I graduated from Andrews University with a degree in political science.
And law school is in the future. And so
Taking a little
congrats,
bit of a
man.
break, but
hmm
eventually.
Congrats. All right, so we have a nifty topic today, and I'm excited to talk about it because it's really more up my alley than most topics. I'm not heavy into the politics, but this is going to be interesting because if you had a prophecy bingo card, this wasn't on it. I tell you that much. Joey, let the audience know what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so one of the things that's kind of taken the internet by storm, and I might have a little bit of a different perspective on it than a lot of what I've been seeing on social media, but I still think
hmm
it's worth talking about. President Trump has declared, I think, the evening of March 15 to the evening of March 16, as a day for American Jews to kind of celebrate a national Sabbath. And in the proclamation, he kind of highlighted the role that American Jews have played throughout American history, including and I'm going to mispronounce the guy's name, but one of the major financiers of the revolution, Solomon something, I believe, was a Jewish man who literally basically spent his entire fortune and died um, in debt because of his sacrifice to finance the revolution. So, but the point is that in this announcement, urging American Jews to take this time to celebrate a national Sabbath and honor the legacy of American Jews. He called for a national Sabbath. Obviously,
Well,
I
let's
think
be
a lot of
specific
people,
here, though. Let's be
yeah.
specific here because, many of our Sunday keeping friends, or some of them call Sunday a Sabbath, right? And so he's
Yeah.
specifically highlighting May 15th to the 16th, which is what people say the Jewish Sabbath, but it's a biblical Sabbath. And it's from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night, evening to evening, according to Leviticus 23. And so that's what's unique about it because many of people from our not political, from our religious background and from our non religious background are all up in arms about it, but for totally different reasons.
Mm, yeah.
So,
No, I
so,
agree with that.
so let's talk about first of all the letter itself. I want to put it up here on the screen and just highlight a couple of the things that I like that he said. He said, right here, I'm looking at it, it says, as president, I will never stop fighting to protect our birthright of religious freedom. And this is important because the Gio and Joey show started from the fact that we have to protect religious freedom. It goes on to say, sacred right that continues to guide our nation, drawing us closer to the Almighty each and every day. Your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, the statement was good. I thought the letter was pretty good overall.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the thing that we would want to just remind people is that, religious liberty, there's two sides to it, right? There's protecting religious Americans and, right, and religious people from encroachments from like the secularists and the secular left that want to squash religion out of the public square, right? Want to violate the free exercise clause, but also there's religious liberty for those religious people, or protecting religious liberty from those religious people who don't quite understand the establishment clause and want to enforce some brand. And so I feel like that's important to notice. But other than that, I appreciated the president's at least that religious liberty is something that he's thinking about.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Look, on the one end, right, as you mentioned, there are people who don't want any religion in the public square, and that they think it is something that you have the right to hold, but only in the privacy of your own home. and you shouldn't bring it outside of your own home and with your own circle of influence. And then there's the opposite, which frankly I'm more worried about, which is the people who want to destroy the separation of church and state and want to establish, for example, Christianity, not by persuasion, because I would like that. I would love for everybody to be a converted follower of Christ, but who wants to establish it by law, by, law in the books and enforcing penalties based on that. And there are some who look at this letter from Trump as a precursor to that. I don't see it as that per se, but it's definitely flirting, or you could say, I don't want to say flirting because that would mean conscience, but it's something that makes you go, And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that has to be said about this is not a law. This is not, there's no penalties attached to this. It's an encouragement, right? We've had things like this in American history, right? President Franklin Roosevelt, right, literally led like a national prayer when he announced the D-Day invasion, right? He prayed for the troops, right? He led the nation in that. President Washington, right, talked about, religion and morality being indispensable supports of free government and these types of things. So there's been these kind of invocations to religion. But yeah, I mean, to your point, there are people, right, and I think they're still a minority, but they're a growing minority of people who do want to tear down the legitimate wall of separation, and I think we should be warned about that. Um, but I think it's also important that we don't dull people's ears to our message by getting too far ahead of our
Crying
skates and
wolf.
saying like, yeah, exactly, saying things saying that things are a violation that aren't, or that,
Mm-hmm.
or that, I won't mention this person's name, but to someone in my friends list who I have seen the phrase "it's over" on his Facebook page to more news stories than I can count. Well,
Yeah.
it can only be over so many
Once it's
times
over.
before you stop listening to his posts. And I
Mm-hmm.
think he's well meaning, and so I'm not going to put him on blast here.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it's really important that we don't go to our too far over our skis in declaring. Because one thing that I would say, right? So I've seen some people in our faith tradition say that we're strict separationists,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that they don't actually quite understand what that means. So, in other words, I am strict about enforcing the legitimate separation of church and state. But
Mm-hmm.
generally, when people use the term strict separationists, they're actually meaning that they want something more akin to France's religious scheme, which France has this thing in their constitution, this principle called laicite, which
Mm-hmm.
is like enforced secularism. So, like in
Yeah.
France, right, an adult French Muslim woman can be
Can.
barred from wearing the burqa, even
Mm-hmm.
and free choice. Well, in America, that Muslim woman would be protected if she wants to wear the burqa in public life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Jews, the kippah, or Christians, a cross or whatever, right? Like, so we don't, in America, we don't have a strict separation in the sense that we don't ban citizens from bringing their faith with them into public life, but we don't allow them to enforce, their religious particulars on other people's consciences.
Early on in our faith tradition, I think it was Jones or Wagner, one of those, wanted to be so strict that he wanted to forego our tax exemption because he thought it was a mingling of church and state. And basically, he was told to shut up and sit down because it wasn't a mingling of church and state. And we see it from scripture. And I don't want to think it's just something that happened early on in our faith tradition. But in scripture, right, when the people of Israel left Egypt, they were allowed to take what the Egyptians gave them, and they left with a bounty of money. Throughout scripture, you see that Herod is the one that beautified the temple, and Artaxerxes is the one that funded the temple after the exile. So it's not about this extreme separation, but it's about drawing the lines clear that the government should not dictate religion by enforcement on anyone. Um, I personally prefer all my presidents to be Christian. I wish all of them were truly faith converted individuals, but not that does not mean that I want them to enforce uh, the Bible by penalty of law, because then that creates, as we know, an image to the beast, and it's what.
Oh, did you just? Your sound just went away. Was that me?
Oh no, sorry, that was me. I pressed the button
Oh,
by
okay,
mistake. So
all good.
we don't want enforced worship. Is what we don't want from anyone, from any side, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So one of the things that so I've been listening in 2 days. I've listened through well, since I think Thursdays when I started, and I've listened
Mm,
to up through chapter 16 of this book. It's I highly recommend it. It's a great history book, The Great Controversy. Obviously, I
okay.
know Gio knows about it.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was listening to the chapters about Wycliffe, Huss, Jerome, and Luther, the thing that I noticed about all four of these men is that you know who their protectors were and their friends were various princes or legislators or governors, right? That these were the people that befriended them and protected them, right? Or we can go to the Bible, right? That while he was a persecutor in one sense, he ultimately became a protector in another, right? The King Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Yeah.
And Christians, right, through from what I like to call old covenant Christians, but they were still Christians, Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
Christians, right? They were still worshiping Christ all the way through, the Reformation. They were not afraid of befriending political people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I've often thought that we should have, you know, rather than always being the doom and gloom, right? Apocalypse is coming. Now, don't get me wrong, the apocalypse is coming, but we should also we should encourage when a politician does stand for liberty of conscience, we should encourage them, and we should reach these people, right? Like we don't know. Again, we don't know every twist and turn that the final crisis is going to take, but I believe that there are people in elected office, whether it's your state legislators, your congressional representatives, whether it's your governor, right, at
Or
all
your
these different
president
levels,
for the all
or
the
your
hate.
president,
Yeah, yeah.
right? We don't know we don't know how God's spirit is going to work upon whose hearts. I mean, because sometimes I see people like obviously, I know what we believe about the papacy, but we forget that every single person in the papacy or in the Catholic Church system is still a human being made in the image of God, loved by him
Mm-hmm.
with a conscience, right? Like something that I think we should pray for as Protestants, we could pray for the Pope, right? We should pray for Leo. That I mean, just and maybe I'm just kind of being a little fanciful here, but we serve a God who can do anything. Just imagine how many people would be reached by the truth if Leo were to convert. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
I just no one is so if there's breath still in their lungs, right? We should be praying for them, and we should pray for leaders of other churches, leaders for our political leaders, rather than just being, you know, like I feel like there can sometimes in our prophecy circles there can be almost a feeling of like all these other people are
Fait accompli.
conspiring to bring
Yeah.
about the end times. But we got to remember, no, we don't. When it comes to the final conflict, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, right? We wrestle against principalities, right? And all those other people that we're looking at as conspiring or whatever, the same great controversy that's going on for your soul or my soul is going on in their consciences as well. So we should present the truth in love, and we should actually, pray for people rather than just, implicate them in some sort of conspiracy.
This is why I love the story of Nebuchadnezzar. And obviously, most people read the story of Nebuchadnezzar and they read it in the book of Daniel. But I'm referring here to Habakkuk. Because in the book of Habakkuk, in chapter 1, what's happening is that Habakkuk is basically talking to God saying, wait a minute, you're going to use this heathen king who is such a brutal man to punish your people? And in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1, and this is what I want people, not verse 1, verse 4. Oops, sorry, wrong screen. Where do we go here? There we go. Let me put you on the screen here real quick. In Habakkuk 2:4, God tells him, behold, he says, as for the proud one, his soul is not right with him, but the righteous will live by faith. And this is important because, right, many quote unquote New Testament Christians say, we're saved, right, by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone, or the just shall live by faith, not knowing or perhaps not comprehending. I think they read it, they're not ignorant, that this whole justification by faith this phrase is found in the Old Testament. And what's fascinating is because Nebuchadnezzar, as bad as he was, and he was cruel, you read the stories, he was cruel. He wasn't, a doting grandfather type figure. He eventually, by the grace of God, converted and wrote a chapter in the Bible, which is known as Daniel chapter 4. But if this man, who everybody around him thought no way would he ever be saved, ends up being saved, we can't say for certain that any politician or any necessarily pope would be lost. What we understand is that God's word is true and it will be fulfilled. But when we have issues with other Christian, like Catholicism or Calvinism, we're talking about the system, not the people. God is amazing. He's loving. He died for everybody. And we need to be leery of that. And so we have to keep our eyes open prophetically, but understand that we don't know the details, which brings me back to the letter, which I said, I didn't see that coming in our prophetic bingo card. Let me turn that off. I want to read this, what the letter goes on to say. Throughout this historic year, he's talking about 2026, we rejoice in the triumph of the American spirit and rededicate ourselves to the cause of liberty and justice for all. In special honor of 250 glorious years of American independence, and on the weekend of Rededicate 250, a national jubilee of prayer, praise, and thanksgiving, Jewish Americans are encouraged to observe a national Sabbath from sundown on May 15 to nightfall on May 16, which is Friday evening to Saturday evening. Friends, family, and communities of all backgrounds may come together in gratitude for our great nation. This day will recognize the sacred Jewish tradition of setting aside time for rest, reflection, and gratitude to the Almighty. I want to take this in two directions, and I'll let you chime in. I think I was the one who sent you the text, or at least in our group chat. Did you get to read any of the comments underneath?
I'm not sure exactly. I read so many posts, various
Okay.
posts from our co-religionists on this. I think so, and I've seen a lot of. If it's, I don't know if we're talking about the same post or not, but I've seen a lot of. The way I would describe it is almost fear, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense,
Okay,
or
well,
like,
I'm talking about the X post. There were a lot of hateful comments. Like, we're not doing this, you
oh,
know, like
the
dropping the,
anti-Semitic stuff.
yeah, the anti Semitic
Yeah, I saw
stuff.
that.
Okay, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this will go to to another positive element of what I think President Trump is doing here.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, so I mentioned it before, right? America's religious liberty tradition, right, in the Constitution has two elements: free exercise clause and non-establishment clause. But these things also tie into each other. And one of the things, the genius of it, is that it ties all of our religious liberty, right? If you're an American, if you're a
Mm-hmm.
Hindu American, if you're a Christian, right, Catholic or Protestant, if you're Jewish, if you're Sikh, Buddhist, Satanist, even, right? Like, no matter if you're a religious American of any sort, your religious liberty is tied in, right? So, in other words, if you are okay with the undermining of anyone else's religious liberty, ultimately that undermines your own
Yes.
because they're tied into each other, right? And the free expression piece is one of those things that's clear. So it says, listen, and what we're seeing a disturbing rise of it, whether it's Hassan Piker or this bozo who's running for Senate here in Michigan, and I can't think of his name right now. But like they're highly anti-Semitic, right? And we're seeing increased anti-Semitic on the left, right? And I would even in parts of even the more mainstream left, right? We're seeing rising anti-Semitism, but then on the far right, right, you have obviously the Groypers, you have the Nick Fuentises, the Tucker Carlsons, Candace
Mm-hmm.
Owens, who are
Megan
also
Kelly.
delving into. They're like reaching their hand, right? The far right and the far left are grabbing each other and like shaking hands on anti-Semitism. But what President Trump did here is elevating, right, Jewish Americans, their contributions to our society, right, and saying like, no, 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 religious liberty is for them too, right? America's for them too. And I would, say the same as an Adventist. I would say, listen, from Muslim American citizens, America's for them too, right? Hindu, right? I've seen so Vivek Ramaswamy just run his primary for the Ohio governors, and I've seen a
And
lot of
one
hate
big.
directed at him.
Mm-hmm.
And he won very big, which I guess that would go to show that while many of these and again these sentiments that America's not for a Hindu
Mm-hmm.
citizen, right, like that would show that at least in Ohio a good majority of the Republican Party there rejects that, and I think that's a good sign. But
Mm-hmm.
we know that there are, certainly online, we know that there's a growing movement of religious intolerance, right, that America is just for Christians, or America's just for white Christians. And again, I don't think, I do not believe that this is a majority at this time, but I do think it is a growing sentiment. And so I think on the positive side of what President Trump did here is he's saying, at least to the anti-Semites, the Trump administration is not with you. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's positive.
And what, for the audience, because I've heard people say this, and so I want to clarify it myself as well. Look, just because Joey and I are for religious freedom and that Muslims should have religious freedom and Hindus and Jews and
Can you
all
still
that.
hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello?
I can hear you.
I can't hear you. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Can you hear me? Mercy.
I'm going to come out and come back in.
Okay. All right. So let me go here. For those listening to while Joey comes back in, what I want to mention, just because I believe in religious freedom for everybody, doesn't mean I deny that Christianity is true and that Christianity is the only way to God. That is not to be disputed. But the reason why it's important to protect the religious liberty of others is because even within Christianity, I'm a Seventh Day Adventist. I worship on the biblical Sabbath from Friday night to Saturday night. But imagine if a Seventh Day Adventist wanted to enforce by law, would you be happy as a Sunday keeper? No. And vice versa. If let's say a Baptist, as a matter of fact, I was having a conversation with a Christian nationalist many months ago where I asked them whose Christianity would rule in America. And I was surprised when he said, I don't care as long as it's Christian. But that's foolish because we all had different tradition. What about forget the Sunday Sabbath debate? What about the conservative Christian and the liberal Christian debate? Would you want, uh, uh, you know, the liberal Methodists to be ruling the country and enforcing their laws, where any marriage stands and any abortion is fine and right, and it's not really in the tenets of biblical Christianity. So that's why we have to protect religious liberty at all costs, because no human is infallible, and we owe our allegiance only to God. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, the point you make isn't even a hypothetical one, right? We
Mm-hmm.
can know what kind of
Oh yes.
theology would govern an American state church by looking at what that church would have been. Well, if they had established a national church, it would have been Episcopal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the National Cathedral in Washington D.C. is an Episcopal church. Well, I've listened to sermons that happen there on a regular, Sunday, and it's a lot of nonsense. I mean, the bishop, it's this woke female bishop. Well, she's the one who did the inauguration,
Oh
right? And
yeah.
talking about trans kids and all these things, right? Or, there are plenty of churches in Europe that still have the countries in Europe that still have a state church. There's the Church of England, Denmark. There's others. I don't want to completely, but those two first, Finland, right? Well, all of those state churches at one time they would have been fairly orthodox, but today they've all drifted, right? Like all
Mm-hmm.
mainstream churches, and right, they have plenty of persecution of Christian views, right? You have pro-lifers arrested in England for praying outside an abortion clinic. In Finland, one of their politicians literally got arrested and jailed for her views on sexuality. Or no, maybe it was Denmark. And again, having a state church, again, it's this point of whose theology is going to govern this. Like, what is that? Like, is that going to be some magic protection? No. In fact, America with no state church is the most and it's not even close. Of talking about the citizenry now and the
Mm-hmm.
culture, it has the most religious culture, the most like actual believing, like evangelical type Christians of any industrial, like westernized nation, right? Like, generally, yes, we've declined from like our peak, but we're still far more religious than all of our peers that have state churches.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a misnomer that having a state church actually even boosts religion, because again, what does it go back to? The Lord loves a cheerful giver.
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't want worship that you're
Enforced.
only giving because you're afraid of punishment.
Hmm. And so going back to the letter here, this is the part that has, I guess, worried people the most. Is this part? It says, "Now therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me in the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim May 2026 as Jewish American Heritage Month." That's not the issue. "I call upon Americans to celebrate the heritage and contributions of Jewish Americans and to observe this month with appropriate programs, activities, and ceremonies." Now, this is a line that I've seen people worry about. "I further call on all Americans to celebrate their faith and freedom throughout this year during this month, and especially on Shabbat to celebrate our 250th year." Now, to me, the way I take this sentence is say, hey, celebrate your faith however you do it. And this Shabbat coming, do something to honor it. But some people are taking this sentence to mean that you should celebrate Shabbat every day for the rest of every Sabbath for the rest of the year. And I don't see that. Do you see that?
Well, I just like I don't read too much into it here. I just think it's
Yeah.
basically saying Americans of all faith throughout this year and during this month, and
Mm,
especially on Shabbat to celebrate the 250th year. I think he's really just kind of calling on all Americans to celebrate their faith. Now, I
yeah.
I understand the impulse, right? Like,
Hmm.
whenever you see a politician saying something religious, right? There's a certain watchman who's gonna say like, "Oh, this could go somewhere," and the way I've like to describe it. Like, I don't think that this statement, in as of itself, I don't think it foretells the final crisis. I
Mm-hmm.
don't even think it's a particularly bad statement. But the way I look at it this way, right? The religious liberty has been described as a pendulum,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for the last century, right, the secular left has been pushing the pendulum against free exercise, right? This way, right? And they've been pushing and pushing and pushing religion more and more out of the public square. And there's a lot of people who I think they're rightfully fed up with that, and so now we're seeing the pendulum being pushed back this way. But the danger with a pendulum is that they don't often, right. So in other words, if the secular left has pushed the religious liberty paradigm way far this way and pushed religion out of public life and all these things, a course correction would be to go back to the constitutional standard that
Mm-hmm.
protects religious expression of all Americans, doesn't establish a church, doesn't enforce religion. That would be here. The danger that we should warn about is what happens when the overcorrection starts going this way, and rather than just protecting everyone's free exercise, we now start establishing a church. That's the danger. But I think in the meantime, I don't think we should say that everything that's pushing the pendulum from here back this way is bad, but we should warn about the dangers of going too far this way. And obviously prophetically, we know at some point it is
Mm-hmm.
going to go too far this way, but that doesn't mean that everything, along the way from here to here is wrong. It's just there is stuff to be concerned about.
Yeah, and that's why I said I don't see it so much as a concern, but definitely more of a let's see where this goes, right? Because
Mhm.
one of the videos I saw from somebody we interviewed, he said it was more to him, it was more like, okay, well, this call to observe a Shabbat this coming Friday evening to Saturday evening is going to elicit tick for tat. Well, if you did it for the Sabbath and our Jewish American friends, then let's do it for Sunday and the majority of evangelicals. Well, that's politics. There's always, you know, if you did it for one party, you should do it for me as well. So let's see where that goes. That's a legit concern. But even if even if they did call for that, um, as long as it's not enforced and it's not mandatory and it's just one day, well, people talk about that all the time. And where we stand, you and I, biblically speaking, it's just we have to teach people and try to persuade people to understand which is the true biblical Sabbath. And that I can have that conversation any day with anybody at any time. It's a seventh day Sabbath, it's never been changed. We have to be alert, but not everything is a clarion call to cry wolf.
Mm. And something else that's been kind of on my heart about all this recently is I had a disturbing Google search where I type in the Sabbath. And listen, I believe this is something that I believe as a Seventh day Adventist that we are to proclaim the immutability of God's law, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that there's power in Christ to keep it, right? And all these things. And yet, of all the positive things I see about Sabbath, like Adventists are not necessarily the top or even the majority of the results. And
Mm-hmm.
then of stuff coming from Adventists about the Sabbath, the vast majority of what we have out there, and actually I didn't see hardly any in the other category. The vast majority of what I see from us is talking about, the Sabbath in the context of a national Sunday law
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
apologetics of why it's Saturday instead of Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I've been thinking, and let's go best intentions, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
people who, yeah, they're maybe getting this wrong, but they're calling on, and there's people on the left and right talking about like a need for a day of like a day of rest and these things. let's just go best intentions. Like, we know they're wrong
Mm-hmm.
to use force in the first tablet, but what are they actually saying when they say this country needs a day of rest? Well, at the core of what they want, there's a truth,
Mm-hmm.
right? They say consumerism and materialism and the 24/7 news cycle and all these things are burning people
Mm-hmm.
out. Well, that's true, right? They're saying, that people, have to work so much, they don't have time for family, they don't have time to relax, to focus on God. Well, all of that is true. The need that the Sunday law advocates are trying to
Addressing.
address
Yeah.
is a real need. Well, part of our message is that there is a Sabbath rest, that the creator of the universe has set aside a time for you to put aside time to spend with him, to spend with, fellow believers, to breathe different, right? Like the positive message of the Sabbath, right? The joy of the Sabbath, the benefits of the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
That I think we should be known for that at a 2-to-1 or a 5-to-1 scale, as has been known for the fear stuff, because that people get fear all the time. And again, we do need to tell the truth about prophecy and these
Yeah.
things, but like the genuine article is what we should be holding up as our standard. And yet, if people want to, the best materials that I can find about the joy of the Sabbath. Charlie Kirk's book
Mm-hmm.
and his stuff on the Sabbath. Well, that's been really great. Even though I don't believe he's not a Seventh Day Sabbatarian. He's a Sunday keeper, but he writes. He's probably the most popular evangelical preacher with younger Christians, and like kind of, and even he's even still got an audience with like the evangelical crowd, but he's still a Christian. John Mark Comer, right? He's written books about like hurriedness and these things, and he's writing about it as like you need this in part of your rhythm of life, and he's writing very persuasively. And what I would just say to my fellow Adventists is we need to you attract more flies with honey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, but when you're always people today are fear overloaded. Kids from as
Yes.
young as they got they're told climate change is an existential fear, polarization is an existential fear,
AI.
terrorism, AI is going to take all your jobs, everything, fear, fear, fear. And if what we lead with is fear, well, then that's just more of the same, and that doesn't motivate people, right? What people like, and the Bible says, right, the Lord did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind, right? And so we should be talking more about the joys of the Sabbath, what a Sabbath will
Whoa,
do.
whoa.
Obviously, yes, freedom's important,
Mm-hmm.
but the Sabbath itself is good.
It's a freedom. And let me jump in here because my two favorite aspects of the Sabbath is one, it's grounded in creation, right? 6 days the Lord worked and then rested on the seventh day. And what's beautiful about that is that Adam and Eve's first full day was resting. And listen to this, if you're not a Seventh day Adventist, Adam and Eve's first full day was resting in the completed work of God, right? It reinforces that lesson that we don't earn our salvation. We rest in his completed work. Obviously, man sinned, Adam and Eve sinned, and we're in this hot mess. But then the Sabbath at the crucifixion played a vital role. He dies right on preparation day, which we know it to be Friday. And then he rests on Saturday. And then he rises on Sunday to newness of life. But he rests there. Why? Because his work of redemption was completed on the seventh
Mm.
day Sabbath. And he goes, quote unquote, back to work on Sunday to right apply the merits of his sacrifice being accepted. And this is why to us in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, the Sabbath is a reminder that we belong to God twice, once by creation and the second time by redemption. And it's reflected in the two versions or the two giving of the Ten Commandments. In Exodus chapter 20, the allusion there is a call back to creation. But in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when God had to rewrite the tablets because Moses threw them down and destroyed them, it's a reminder that we were once slave in Egypt. Well, for us in the Christian circle living today, we were once slave to sin. And the Sabbath is a reminder that we belong to Him twice, by creation and redemption. And that's the beauty of the Sabbath. And that's what we should be known for, not the fear-mongering. Thoughts?
No, I completely agree with that. And I think we need to be more proactive about getting that positive message before people, right? There's so many people who just have so many burdens, right, in our communities, right? And a message that I just, what you just said there, I just think is the key, right? The Sabbath is rest, right? The Sabbath is a reminder of your worth, right? You are
Mm-hmm.
created by God, right? You were created in the image of God. So the Sabbath is a reminder of your worth in an age that, where people are saying, human beings are going to be replaced by machines, or, an age, the secularists who say, we're all just the product of,
Nothing.
long processes of evolution, and ultimately we come from nothing. Life, what does Shakespeare's character in Macbeth say? Life is a life is something full of signifying
Ah,
nothing. I
yeah.
can't remember the actual quote, but it's a good one. It's not a good one, but it's a good one to illustrate what I'm saying here. So, like, that's what our culture says. But the Sabbath says, no, no, no. You were created in the image and likeness of a holy God. You're worth everything. And not only that, and then the Sabbath also says, right, in Deuteronomy 5, that this God cared enough to deliver you, right? So whether it was
Mm-hmm.
the Israelites delivering them from physical bondage, but that's always been a metaphor for the fact that Christ delivers us from sin, or He will if we ask Him, right? And so not only is the Sabbath, right, it's a reaffirmation of a person's worth, right, as an image bearer of God. It's a reaffirmation of the fact that they either have deliverance or they have it on offer, and they just have to ask, right? And, like, it's a reminder of those things. And I think that positive message, I think, would actually win people to the truth of the Sabbath even more than proof texting them. And don't get me wrong, we can proof text because the texts are
Mm-hmm.
on our side, right? The
Yeah.
Sabbath is the seventh day. But, like, knowing that the Bible teaches that it's the seventh day, I don't think that in and of itself is going to, that'll convert a few nerds, right? That'll convert a few nerds, but, like, that combined with the deeper meaning of the Sabbath will, I think, really pierce hearts and minds in a much more powerful way. Right? I
I
mean,
mean, well, look at it this way, right? We live in a go-go society, right? Where news is blasted at us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and everything is trying to get the next dopamine high. Well, the Sabbath is a reminder. And right now, for example, for those who follow basketball, the basketball playoffs, NBA playoffs are taking place, right? Till June, basically around Father's Day. Well, there are games that are played on Friday, and for me, as a Seventh Day Adventist, this from Friday evening till Saturday evening, I put away all secular things away. I don't follow sports. I don't care if it's a game 7 of my favorite teams. I remember one year the Bulls, Celtics are my favorite team, but I was a big Michael Jordan fan. They clinched game 7. I didn't watch it. Why? Because my relationship to God is more important. And so that day I get to unplug. And sometimes people see that as legalism, but come on. What was the old illustration, right, of two people cutting down a tree? One stops to sharpen his axe and the other one doesn't. And it looks like he's losing ground, but in the end, he chops the tree down. Why? Because we need a period of rest. God built that in. And besides the whether it's the first day of the week or the seventh day of the week, another thing that I find that my Sunday keeping friends miss out is, let's say it is Sunday, right? For argument's sake, you're right, it's Sunday. But y'all don't even keep Sunday. You go to church for 1 hour and then it's business as usual for the rest of the day. You don't even take 24 hours to concentrate. And so what I like to do is first and foremost on the Sabbath, I concentrate on God, right? Yes, we worship God every day of the week, but we have to work. We have to take kids to school. We have to shop. We have to buy things. So Sabbath, I concentrate on God, concentrate on my family, right? Kids go to school, you're separated there. Spouse goes to work, you're separated there. You come home, cook dinner, maybe relax an hour or two, and then you got to rinse and repeat the next day. No, the Sabbath, we're all home, we're all worshiping together. We spend time in nature, observing God's creation. We do acts of service and we spend time with our friends. It bonds us in a community. That's the joy of the Sabbath. It's not legalism, it's resting in His completed work. I don't have to work 7 days a week to get ahead. I trust in Him. Just like we return tithe and realize that 85% with God is better than 100% without Him, it's the same way with we give Him one entire day. And I'm going to do a little humble bragging here. Seventh-day Adventist people are the people who live the longest and the healthiest and are economically above the average families in America. Why? Because God's ways are always the best way. Enough of my rant. Go ahead.
No, I fully agree. And bringing that back to the Sabbath is in the news because the president, is doing this Jewish heritage thing. What if our primary response as people who, I believe we were tasked with a message, right? And central to that message is the Sabbath. What if our primary response to the Sabbath being in the news was to flood the algorithms with the joy of the Sabbath?
Yeah.
I mean, I cannot go, I don't know about your algorithm, but the ads for both on Facebook when I'm scrolling videos or YouTube when I'm like watching videos on YouTube, like every other ad is missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, saying like, "Hey, would you like to know Jesus Christ and come and worship with us this Sunday?" I was like, well, listen, I obviously I have LDS friends, right? We had one of my LDS friends on our podcast, and I love LDS people. I think they're super adorable, but obviously I have disagreements. But one thing that I appreciate about them is that they believe their message and they do whatever they can to get it in front of the people. And I would just say this is now I'm going to make a clarion call to our fellow Adventists, but also to our fellow Torah observant Christians. I think of our friend Melissa or Ryan or others who also keep or David Wilbur, right? Who keep who keep Torah, who keep the Sabbath. Now is a perfect moment to be making content with hashtags about the Sabbath, right? With titles about the Sabbath, right? Because the most powerful man in the free world is guiding the news cycle talking about the Sabbath, at least for a short amount of time. And on this Sabbath of May 15th and May 16th, we should have concerted effort to reach people with the truth of not just, yes, it's the Jewish Sabbath, and I love my Jewish friends, but the biblical Sabbath, right? The truth of the Sabbath. Like, let's lead with joy, right? Let's not lead with fear, right? Let's lead with with power and love and a sound mind.
Yeah. You're inspiring me as well because maybe I'll do something on Friday night, just a simple Bible study on the Sabbath. And I'll leave out the prophetic part of it and just concentrate. I'll see if I do that this Friday night. But look, ultimately, uh, and you alluded to where I wanted to go to next, a clarion call to people. Be ready to give a defense for what you believe in, because that Friday that Trump called for is this coming Friday. It's this coming Sabbath. And we need to be ready to give an answer for why we believe in Jesus Christ and yet still keep a seventh-day Sabbath. And as you alluded to earlier, the biblical evidence is on our side. And I challenge my my Sunday keeping friends, in any AI, type this. Not that AI is the final word, but it'll be, in a sense, from your standpoint, more objective than we will be, right? Because you think we're biased or this. Just type in, based on the Bible and the Bible alone, which day is the Sabbath? Now, you have to phrase it that way because the way AI works is that it takes the most popular teachings and uses that as its foundation, and then you got to push against it if it's wrong, right? But just type, based on the Bible and the Bible alone, which is the Sabbath day. And I've tried it on Grok, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, and when you phrase it that way, it's a seventh day Sabbath.
Mm.
So there you go. That's your little challenge. Joey, as we wrap up here, what are your final thoughts?
So I'm going to say something controversial about religious liberty.
Okay, go ahead.
So, first of all, everybody knows, I mean, obviously, the Gio Joey Show, we're very much founded because we believe in religious liberty. We support religious liberty. But a thought that keeps coming to my head when I see a lot of our religious liberty work and when I see posts from, my fellow Adventists about religious liberty is that a lot of it is framed, and again, coming back to this fear-based narrative, it and again, I'm not speaking of any individual person's heart, right? Because, I don't know that. But I'm just saying the framing of their words and the way they talk about the stories is that it's from a place of fear about persecution that, we believe is going to come on God's, end time people, right? Those, and not just Seventh-day Adventists, but those Christians who keep the commandments of God and that side with liberty of conscience, right, in the final crisis. Right? So we believe that persecution's coming. I believe that persecution's coming. But the point of our religious liberty work is not to secure protection for ourselves. Now, I believe I love living in a country where I have religious liberty, but I see no evidence from the state of the American church that religious freedom creates better Christians. Because when I compare, my good friend is now a missionary in Nigeria, but when I compare the experience of my Nigerian brothers and sisters in Christ and the state of the American church, and doesn't matter what denomination, when I compare Nigerian Christians to American Christians, I see a spirit, I see a vitality, I see a boldness that I don't see in the American church, whether Adventists, whether Sunday keeping, it doesn't matter, right? Because we're fat, we're happy, we're lazy. We've taken our freedom and we've abused, and something Pastor Ron Kelly is we've abused freedom to the point of licentiousness, right? And yet these Christians who, if they're coming to church, they're coming to church knowing that an Islamist could show up and slaughter the
Behead
entire
them. Yeah.
congregation, and they're still showing up anyway. And so in other words, and again, this is not an argument against religious liberty because I think God calls us to protect religious liberty. That's why we speak out about the religious liberty being violated in Nigeria. But the main purpose, especially as an Adventist church, of our religious liberty work is evangelistic. It's us saying it goes to what we have to say about the character of God. We serve a God who doesn't want forced worship, right? And so when we defend religious liberty for the Sunday keeping Christian, right? There was an Adventist on his legal team at the Groff Supreme Court case, the postal worker, right? So when we defend religious liberty for a Sunday keeping Christian or for a Hindu American or a Muslim American or, for
Jewish
all these
American.
other people, what we are saying as a church, we're not saying we agree with their theology. We don't, right? And often I know some of these lawyers will literally, after the case is over, will share a great controversy with them. But what we're saying to them in helping them defend their religious liberty is the God that we serve, yes, he's the only way to salvation, but he will never force you to choose him, right? He cares about your conscience. That's the primary reason for it, right? But at the end of the day, all of our heroes, right, that we look up to, right, when we read the Great Controversy, right, when we talk about Huss or Jerome or any of these people either died martyrs' deaths, or were exiled, were spat upon, right, were abused, right. Every single one of the apostles, right. So first of all, Jesus was suffered the most excruciating physical torment, and yet the mental torment was even worse, and he died, right? Every single one of the apostles was martyred except for John, but the only reason he wasn't martyred is because they boiled him in oil and he wouldn't die. So they banished him to the island of Patmos, right? In the first 3 centuries of the church had no political power, and yet they spread, right, mainly by the witness of Christians. I'm also reading Fox's Book of Martyrs for my devotions
Hmm.
right now. For the first 300 years of the church, the gospel spread by the witness of Christians being burned alive, filleted, right? Sorry to be graphic, but that's what happened,
Mm.
right? Filleted, burned alive, put on the rack. And yet they went to
Thrown
those
to
deaths
lions. Yeah.
with a hymn, with a prayer and a hymn on their heart, on their lips, right? Like, so our religious liberty, again, we should be thankful for it. We should seek to preserve it mainly so that the gospel can still go out
Flourish.
here for as long as we possibly can. So, like, religious liberty is important. I still am going to defend it, but our own religious liberty is not the summum bonum of an Adventist life, right? No, our purpose is to give out our message whether we have liberty or not, and to stand firm for the truth. And so I just think that's my other call, right? So I did the call about proclaiming the Sabbath. My other call is I'm going to encourage everybody, regardless of your whether you're Adventist, whether you're not Adventist, read the book Fox's Book of Martyrs, and then reread it, and then reread it again,
Hmm.
and read the Great Controversy, particularly the history of Wycliffe, Huss, Jerome, and Luther. Right? Read this history. Read the rest of it too. It's good,
Hmm.
but especially the history of from Wycliffe to Luther, and pray and ask God for the strength to suffer persecution. Right? And and this is the hard one, and this is the one that I still struggle with praying, because I was like, what if God does it? But I think that something that we should be praying for is that if our own martyrdom or persecution would lead to the salvation of souls, then pray for that. And I don't know. I'm not going to keep
Okay.
ranting here, but I
I'll
can't recommend these
summarize it.
works enough.
I'll summarize it this way. Ready? Because as you were ranting, I thought of this quote: "The church is never at its purest until it suffers persecution." And why is that?
Hmm.
Because you're not going to stick around unless you believe it's true, right? So listen to that again. The church is never at its purest until it suffers persecution. And that is because only those who really cling to Christ are going to stay when persecution comes. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, stay faithful until the end and you will receive the crown of life.
Amen.